Trump clashes with Maine Governor and White House over transgender athletes. On Friday, President Donald Trump clashed with Maine's Democratic Governor, Janet Mills, during a White House meeting over the president's attempt to deny federal funding to the state due to its policies regarding the inclusion of transgender athletes. The confrontation took place during a session of governors when President Trump sought to pressure Mills over the state's decision to allow transgender athletes to participate in sports competitions. With a firm stance, Trump warned Mills that her policies could have serious consequences, claiming that his administration was ready to take strong action against states that promoted the inclusion of transgender people in women's sports. This sparked a direct exchange between the two, with Governor Mills responding, "We will see you in court." Trump, confident as ever, responded that he looked forward to that moment and predicted the end of her political career for opposing his executive order. This clash wasn't just a showdown between the president and the governor of Maine, but also a vivid representation of the deep political polarization that is defining the national debate on transgender rights in the United States. Trump and Mills, coming from opposite political parties with fundamentally opposing views on this issue, had already exchanged barbs over the past 24 hours, which led to this fiery confrontation. The root of this dispute lies in a highly controversial topic in recent years: the right of transgender athletes to participate in sports according to their gender identity. President Trump has been one of the loudest critics of such policies. During his administration, he signed an executive order aiming to prevent transgender athletes from competing in women's sports at the federal level, particularly in educational settings and in competitions sponsored by the government. Trump's stance on the issue is based on the belief that biologically male athletes could have physical advantages over women, which he argues would compromise fairness in women's sports. On the other hand, advocates for transgender inclusion argue that allowing transgender individuals to compete in sports based on their gender identity is fundamentally a human rights issue, one that centers on equality and access to opportunities for all athletes, regardless of gender. The executive order Trump signed earlier this month is part of a broader effort by his administration to reverse some of the policies put in place under the Obama administration, particularly those that supported LGBTQ+ rights. This order specifically aims to prohibit transgender women from competing in women's sports in federally funded institutions, including public schools and universities. This initiative has generated a significant amount of debate, with strong opinions on both sides of the issue. Some states, like Maine, have adopted progressive measures to ensure transgender people are included in sports according to their gender identity. Governor Janet Mills has been particularly outspoken in defending these rights. Mills and her administration have worked to create an environment where transgender individuals can live with dignity and equality. As a result, the clash with Trump was almost inevitable. The president's order demanded that Mills change course, warning that her state could face severe consequences, including the loss of federal funding. Governor Janet Mills has become one of the most vocal advocates for transgender rights in the United States. Under her leadership, Maine has passed several policies aimed at protecting transgender people in the areas of healthcare, education, and public services. Governor Mills has been a firm believer in treating transgender individuals with respect and inclusion, ensuring that they have equal access to opportunities in all aspects of life, including sports. Her administration has also worked closely with advocacy groups to protect transgender students in public schools and to ensure that they have equal rights to participate in extracurricular activities. Mills has been a strong defender of the transgender community and has resisted efforts to roll back those protections. Her stance is in stark contrast to President Trump's, who has consistently pushed for policies that many view as discriminatory against transgender people. The tension between Mills and Trump reached its peak during their public exchange at the White House, and this incident is likely to fuel the ongoing national debate over the rights of transgender athletes. As the confrontation unfolded, it was clear that both leaders were firmly entrenched in their positions, with little room for compromise. The public spectacle of this clash not only highlighted the divide between state and federal policies on transgender inclusion, but also underscored the personal stakes involved for both leaders. For Trump, the issue is a central part of his broader political agenda, which includes appealing to conservative voters who are opposed to the inclusion of transgender people in sports. For Mills, defending transgender rights has become a key part of her political identity, particularly in her efforts to position Maine as a progressive state that prioritizes inclusion and equality. In addition to the clash over federal funding, another major development following the White House meeting was the announcement that the U.S. Department of Education would open an investigation into the Maine Department of Education's handling of transgender athletes. This investigation comes as part of the Trump administration's broader push to challenge state policies that promote transgender inclusion in sports. The Department of Education's probe will likely scrutinize how Maine's policies align with federal regulations regarding equal treatment of male and female athletes. The outcome of this investigation could have significant implications for Maine's transgender policies and could ultimately lead to legal challenges. The investigation could also set a precedent for how other states that have adopted similar transgender inclusion policies might be treated by the federal government. In the wake of the confrontation, public reactions have been swift and divided. Supporters of President Trump have praised his stance on transgender athletes, arguing that it's necessary to protect the integrity of women's sports. They contend that allowing transgender women to compete against biological women creates an unfair playing field. On the other hand, advocates for transgender rights have condemned Trump's actions, calling them discriminatory and harmful to transgender people, particularly transgender youth. They argue that excluding transgender athletes from sports based on their gender identity is an act of exclusion and a denial of basic rights. The clash between Trump and Mills also raises important questions about the role of federal authority versus state authority. While the federal government has long had a role in regulating policies related to civil rights, states have traditionally had more control over local matters like education and sports. The Trump administration's efforts to impose federal mandates on issues like transgender inclusion in sports highlight the ongoing tension between state sovereignty and federal oversight. This dynamic is likely to continue as the issue of transgender rights in sports remains a focal point in national politics. Looking ahead, it's clear that this confrontation is far from over. The legal battle that Governor Mills hinted at could be a prolonged and contentious one, with both sides likely preparing for a lengthy court fight. The outcome of this legal challenge could set important precedents for how transgender athletes are treated in the future, not just in Maine, but across the entire country. As the nation watches this conflict unfold, it will be interesting to see how other states respond to similar challenges, and whether the federal government will continue its push to limit transgender inclusion in sports, or if state-level efforts like those in Maine will stand as a model for other progressive states.